Okay, so welcome everyone to the session. My name is Helen Juice and I'm the Interim Senior Advisor for Gender Diversity and Inclusion in CGIAR's workplaces. Delighted to be here and delighted to welcome you to this event that's been organised by our Wellness ERG. So supported by the CGIAR's GDI function, the Wellness CRG has been focused on topics related to physical and emotional health and well-being. Obviously, this is a really important subject right now. We're all still dealing with the impacts of the pandemic, and there's also uncertainty or increased workload that comes from the transition to One CGIAR. So we recognize this is a time when people perhaps are really looking for more information around emotional and physical health and well-being. So the EGR runs lots of activities like this. They're focused on educational seminars, webinars on wellness, contests, group discussions, and other practical health-focused activities. And the EGRs are open to everyone and provide a forum for staff to express themselves openly. And we'll be providing more details at the end of this session about how you can get involved and who to contact. But for now, I want to introduce you to Edwin from Include Consulting, who's going to be facilitating this session. Over to you, Edwin.
Thank you, Helen, and a warm welcome to everyone. And it's such an honor to be with you here today in this call. I recognize that all of us are dialing in from different physical locations, different time zones. And before we dive into the content, I would like to invite you to arrive into this space together. I recognize the distractions and stresses of our day-to-day lives, and we're just going to take a minute to center ourselves. So before we begin, I would like to invite you to participate in this guided meditation with either your video on or off. You are more than welcome to close your eyes and get in a comfortable, grounded position. For myself, I like to place my feet on the ground. You can either choose to stand up or stay seated. And this is a sample meditation from Headspace. No matter what is going on in your life right now, no matter how many thoughts are racing around your mind, no matter how the body is feeling, just take a moment to sit down and take a big, deep breath. Breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth. As you breathe in, a sense of taking in fresh air, the lungs expanding. As you breathe out, a sense of letting go of any stress in the body, in the mind. Just feeling the muscles soften and relax. We'll do this one more time. Breathing deeply in through the nose and out through the mouth. And just take a moment to pause. Allow the thoughts to come and go, and then just gently open your eyes again. Always enjoy doing this very simple mindfulness exercise to just really help ground me, and I hopefully for yourself as well. But before we begin today's agenda, I'd like to introduce Claudia Sadov, the Executive Management Team Convener and Managing Director of Research Delivery and Impact, to open and address us today as we talk about mental health.
Thank you so much, Edwin. And thank you for guiding us through that meditation exercise. It's extraordinary what a difference just a moment to yourself can make. And let me express my great appreciation to the Wellness ERG for organizing this event. Mental health is such an integral and essential component of health and well-being. But mental health is one of the most neglected and misunderstood areas of public health. Here's some statistics that highlight why we should be focusing on mental health. close to 1 billion people are living with a mental disorder. Mental and behavioral disorders, such as depression and anxiety, can cost the global economy $1 trillion each year in lost productivity. These data tell us that mental health has a significant implication in our workplaces and our societies. But frankly, these data don't begin to convey the toll that mental health challenges can take on an individual, their families, and their loved ones. And relatively few people choose to seek support and openly speak about this topic. We feel very good asking our colleagues and coworkers how they're feeling when they're recovering, say, from a bike accident. But how likely are we to check in on each other's mental well-being? Talking about mental health can feel much too personal. It can feel very tricky, really almost treacherous to ask colleagues. But the problem is that when we deliberately avoid addressing mental health at work, stigma grows. And in order to break this cycle, we have to address the issue proactively, strategically, and thoughtfully. We can hopefully achieve this by creating psychologically safe spaces for us to openly discuss our mental health. And research has shown that when we do, we're likely to be happier, less stressed, and more confident and productive in our jobs. To do this, we have to have a better understanding of mental health. And each and every one of us needs to practice allyship and making mental health a priority. Because this is so very important, I am excited to have Edwin from Include Consulting here today to help us learn more about mental health and how we can better support one another by practicing allyship. Thank you, and back to you, Edwin.
Thank you, Claudia, for the nice opening. So our agenda today is one that will take us through, firstly, understanding and defining mental health. We'll open with that through a short poll in just a couple of minutes. Secondly, we'll talk about the implications and the stigma that Claudia mentioned about that people in the workplace face when discussing mental health issues. And then we move into what is allyship? How can we best practice it for each other so that we can create psychologically safe spaces? And lastly, we'll wrap up together, each leaving this session with one action that we'd like to commit towards fostering more inclusive, more safe workplaces for each and every single one of us. So to really get the most out of this workshop, of the hour that we have together, I only have 3 top tips for you to get the most out of this. Firstly, participate actively. Right after this, we're going straight into a Mentimeter quiz, just to really help us to understand what mental health is. Secondly, be curious and listen to some of the contents, the experiences, and some of the research that has been shown around mental health. And thirdly, I encourage you to embrace discomfort. Talking about it, and even as I prepared for this workshop in itself, was pretty discomforting and oftentimes uncomfortable. But I realized that when you lean into it, that's where you can really push yourself out of your comfort zone to create more safe spaces and to practice allyship. So without further ado, let's take the time now to better understand mental health. And I'd like to do this through a very simple Mentimeter poll. So if you could slowly either grab your device or either on your laptop, I'll be launching my screen now. And there will also be a Mentimeter link that will be dropped in the chat so that you can immediately register and get yourself signed up. Let's start with a short, simple quiz about mental health. And let me just share my screen. Okay, so let's start with this first question that we see here. Is it true or false? Our mental health is determined by a range of socioeconomic, biological, and environmental factors. Is this true or is this false? So you can log in with the link, or you can also log in through mentimeter.com and use the code 63867184. I see some of you have voted. Let's show the results. Okay, thank you for contributing. Okay, so as we can see, majority of us, it is true, right? Our mental health is an integral and essential component of health. We all have it. And this is influenced by multiple social, psychological, and biological factors that determines one's level of mental health at any point in time. For example, an individual who has experienced violence or persistent socioeconomic pressures or a stressful work condition could result in someone experiencing low levels of mental health. And therefore, it is a result of all these different factors coming together. Let's move on to the second one. This could be slightly interesting to see your response towards. I'm just going to close the voting. Let's go to the next question. One is considered mentally healthy when they do not have a mental illness. Is this true or false? Let me just give some moments for us to take a guess, and then we'll slowly share the results shortly. Okay, and as I can see from majority of the responses so far, the correct answer is false. I have to admit myself, when I first read up the statement, I actually thought it was true that the opposite, if I do not have a mental illness, I am mentally healthy. But actually, the research that I'll share with you later, especially when we read up the clear definitions from the World Health Organization and the Center for Disease Control, really helps to separate between the two. Being mentally healthy is more than just the absence of a mental illness. They are, however, interconnected, but they are not considered on the same spectrum altogether. And I'll unpack this concept a little bit clearer as I move into the slides and we defined together the difference between a mental illness and also mental health in itself. So when we look at the definition of mental illness, this is from the Center for Disease Control. It is a formally diagnosed health condition that affects an individual's ability towards thinking, feeling, their behaviors, and their mood, or their mood altogether. And some examples of a diagnosed mental illness can include depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia. And depending on the severity of the mental illness that one may have, it could range from serious to the other end of the spectrum, which is minimal, or to also be diagnosed with no mental illness. So therefore, this is how we define what a mental illness is. On the other hand, let's move on to mental health. And this is defined by the World Health Organization. So to the World Health Organization, mental health is a state of well-being in which an individual realizes their own abilities for them to be able to cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively, and is able to make a contribution to their community. As mentioned earlier, we all have mental health. And this includes emotional, social, and psychological well-being. So the key differentiator here is that we all have mental health. However, for mental illness, it of course depends if you have been diagnosed with it accordingly. The biggest also misconception or confusion is that one might be diagnosed with a mental illness, such as bipolar, as mentioned earlier. However, they could be experiencing high levels of mental health. And therefore, they are both interconnected, but they are on different continuums as well. And that's the one concept that I'd like to clarify when we look at the difference between the two. So if we look at mental health in itself, and we all have it, let's look about how do we recognize high levels of mental health and low levels of mental health. And I'd like to share the work that was conducted by Corey Keyes, and he is an American sociologist and psychologist known for his work and research around mental health. And in his research, where he was conducting it back in 1995, he found and established that mental health is a continuum that starts off with high mental health, and he describes that state of what we call flourishing, right? And this is a state where you have high levels of energy, high levels of confidence, you are feeling engaged, joyful, and energetic. And what research he has found was that individuals who are at the high mental health state of flourishing end up reporting fewer missed days of work, the lower risk of cardiovascular diseases, and higher positive psychological traits like intimacy and resilience. If we look at the other end of the spectrum of mental health, this is one that he describes as is called languishing. This is where an individual is feeling empty and there is a lack of energy, resulting in the person feeling dissatisfied and stagnant. So I recognize that, especially during the pandemic, this was actually a situation myself, my friends, and perhaps even some of you on the call might have experienced over time. If you felt disconnected, you felt irritable, confused, or just the inability to feel excited, you might have experienced languishing. And he recognizes that we, as a continuum, that we oscillate between the two. The one key implication that he also found of why it's so important to recognize where we are was that he found that for individuals who are in a constant, prolonged state of languishing, the risk of being diagnosed with a mental illness such as depression was nearly about 6 times greater among languishing individuals than flourishing individuals. And hence he advocated so much, and it's so important now for us to be able to recognize where are we on this continuum of mental health altogether, recognizing the implications depending on the state that we're in. So the one thing I'd like you to consider now, if we look at this continuum, and not to worry, you do not need to type in the chat or ask to explain yourself. I'm going to launch very shortly a Mentimeter asking you one question related to where would you place yourself on the continuum? When we look at flourishing, where you're feeling engaged, joyful, and energetic, and the other end of the continuum where you're experiencing languishing, feeling empty, dissatisfied, and stagnant. I'd like you to pause and reflect for a moment over the past few months, or even the reflecting on last year. Where would you place yourself on the continuum? As you reflect and ponder on this, I'm just slowly going to launch the Mentimeter for you to pause and share confidentially about your response. And I have to acknowledge, I appreciate everyone for being so open and also vulnerable for answering this question as well. And that starts to help really break the stigma and to have open conversations about our mental health. All right. What I do observe here is that I can see a nice overall bell curve. And that's also the research of what Corey Keyes has found, where majority of us are usually in the center when we're looking at the whole continuum around mental health. So that's very interesting to see here. Thank you for sharing these responses. I can see the average score sits at a 3.2, somewhere right in the center. Now, let me ask you a follow-up question. How comfortable are you to discuss about the topic around mental health, your mental health, or others' mental health in the workplace? You can answer from a range feeling 5, I'm very comfortable, to 1, not comfortable at all. Where would you place yourself on the scale? And let's look at the general sentiment of where we sit on having open discussions about our mental health. All right, and similarly, I see that we are still in a similar score of the previous one as well. I can see once again, a very good spread across the board. One of the things that it's very clear and evident to us is that since the pandemic started, it has definitely taken an impact on our mental health over time, in some ways more severe than others. However, what we do recognize is that discussing about our mental health and opening up about it in our workplace is still very stigmatized. And because of that, it makes it very challenging for individuals experiencing challenges with their mental health to seek help. And a lot of research that has been done, particularly one that I would like to share, done by the Institute of Psychiatry in King's College of London. They did a study across 144 research papers that included 90,000 over participants from across the globe. And they found that the stigma attached to discussing mental health and mental illness remains one of the top reasons that people are afraid to seek help and ask for professional support. And some of the stereotypes that exist, because when it comes to mental health, it is one that is often very uncomfortable, because it could actually result in people believing that anyone with mental health concerns could be dangerous or ill-intended or potentially be violent or hurting other people, right? And this has created an environment where people are not the most open to speak about it, and I can see it reflected in some of our sentiments from all of you here today. So thank you for sharing that. And I'd like to now share a really short video that really illustrates the difficulty about opening up about mental health. So this is actually a campaign called I'm Fine. And this was run in the UK to start a dialogue about mental health in our society and in our workplaces. Take a look, watch this short video, and just look at the responses, and perhaps even you might resonate with some of them as well.
We asked, how are you feeling? But how are you really feeling?
I think I would say I'm fine, I'm okay, just not to get into any details. I would say, fine, thank you.
I'm fine.
Why? Because sometimes we don't want to tell other people how we are actually feeling because we don't want to be judged, or we don't want to burden them with our problems if we aren't feeling well, or we're afraid to tell them how we're actually feeling. But I do believe we should be honest with our feelings.
I feel that how I feel affects other people in my life, and I'd rather temporarily give them an answer that would be more uplifting.
Usually I'd say I'm fine.
I'm good, thank you. Fine.
I'm fine.
Many times I've found myself in my life that I've had to pretend with people. It's not their fault, a lot of it, but I've had to pretend with some people so as I don't let them, you know, just maybe some of them, like I said, maybe some of them wouldn't understand, and probably I don't expect them to.
I'm fine, thank you.
I'm fine. Sometimes people ask you how you are, but they don't really mean how are you. It's just sort of a thing they're saying as like hello or whatever. But if someone really wants to know how I'm feeling, I will tell you. I would just say I'm fine.
There's nothing more boring than hearing a list of ailments from somebody when all you really need to know is whether actually he's okay or she, or whether there's anything that really he or she really wants to talk about, which is seldom in terms of casual acquaintances.
If it's a sort of ritual, cliche kind of conversation, you're passing somebody in a corridor at work, then you just answer what you answer, and it's usually positive.
Fine, everything's wonderful in the world.
I really like this short video of seeing everyday people and how they respond to it. And some of us might also have been in such situations where we ask a fellow colleague, a close friend, or a family member, how are you doing? And oftentimes we might get a different response altogether, that one could be really afraid to be truly honest and open to share with you their current state of their mental health. So one thing that we can take away from this as we discuss about mental health and the statistics that were brought up earlier is that we have a long way to go to create workplaces where people can bring their full selves to work. And to achieve this, one tool that can really help us to get there is allyship. And the most exciting thing about allyship, it was actually the most researched word on dictionary.com in 2020. It became the word of the year ever since the pandemic started. And this is also a concept in itself that people might not be the most familiar with. So let's together unpack this and how can we better practice allyship and to be a better mental health ally. And before we do that, let's go back to the Mentimeter, and I'd love to hear from you. What are some of the words that come to mind when you think about allyship? So you'll be able to go back into your Mentimeter, take some time to reflect, and type into the Menti, what are some words that come to mind?
Edwin, we're getting a grey box and a fuzzy screen again. You might want to come in and out one more time.
Sure. I love the choices of words that I see. We have friendliness, community support, empathy, listening, check-ins, patience, buddiness. Covers your 6. Okay, great. So let's keep them coming. We'll definitely save the word cloud and also make sure that's uploaded as well. These are great choices of words. So together, let's unpack what is allyship and define it through a lens that really is holistic and gets us to really rethink and review this all together. So the definition that I will be using is from Erskine back in the, and these are researchers who have done a lot of work when it comes to practicing, using privilege to practice allyship in the workplace. Allyship is an active, lifelong, consistent practice of unlearning and re-evaluating our own beliefs and actions. We recognize that we as individuals have been brought up in a world baked with values and cultures of how we view it altogether. And to really step into practicing effective allyship will firstly start with us really recognizing what are those stereotypes that I hold, what are those beliefs and values that I hold, and being able to pause and unlearn and reevaluate them altogether. And then it's a life, and this is always a consistent, lifelong, active practice, which oftentimes can be really uncomfortable, and perhaps even us making some mistakes along the way as we question them. And when we start unlearning and reevaluating our beliefs, we use this newfound approach to work in solidarity with a marginalized individual or a group of people that need our support. And in this scenario, practicing allyship for those who are perhaps struggling with a mental illness or also struggling with low levels of mental health. And why is allyship so popular, and why are people making so much effort to understand it and practice it? Because what research has found is that allyship can be truly a source of good and a powerful force to be reckoned with. Because what we constantly find is that when one individual practices allyship, it helps the other person to feel supported and included. And when they see this behavior of a certain individual practicing it, other people are motivated to step up. And when other people step up and practice it, it shifts the culture of one that is inclusive, one that is safe, which eventually is an organization, culture directive that actually will bring us better benefits and higher performance. And this is where allyship is so critical for us, and one that we should constantly prioritize because of the huge ripple effect that it has. And let's really break it down very simply, how to begin practicing allyship and recognizing that these are actions that we've put together wherever you are in the organization. And there are two different types of allyship actions that we'll like to walk you through in the last section of this workshop. Firstly, we have individual actions, and these are actions to really, on ourselves, to relearn, to reevaluate, and to model good behavior, and to also change our mindsets. On the other hand, we also have interpersonal allyship actions, where we use our newfound knowledge and awareness to make sure that we are supporting our colleagues and each other through our day-to-day interactions with others, likely to happen over conversations on Zoom, on Teams, and even when we are in the office as well. We'll go through a series of different actions and frameworks that you can use to practice allyship at an individual level and at an interpersonal level. Let's start with individual. Firstly, first individual action that you can consider is to be open and share with your colleagues, your teammates, about your current state of mental health and your struggles. Almost everyone has experienced some level of discomfort, and being open and honest about your mental health struggles opens the doors for others to be comfortable talking with you about their own challenges as well. It makes you appear human, relatable, and courageous. And research has shown that such authentic behavior can cultivate trust and improve employee engagement as well. A second individual allyship action that you can consider is prioritizing self-care and setting boundaries. It's one thing to be sharing that mental health is important. it is also equally, or if not more important, to walk the talk and to prioritize it. Right? Modeling good mental health behaviors and openly sharing, for example, that I'm taking a walk in the middle of the day, or I'm having a meeting to discuss my mental health with my therapist, or I'm prioritizing a vacation and turning off my email notifications so I do not burn out, right? And more often or not, it's something that we don't regularly do. We tend to look out for our team members, but oftentimes forget to take care of ourselves. And to be a role model is really practicing the right self-care and also setting boundaries for yourself. Thirdly, take the time to also educate yourself about mental health topics, challenges, and some of the emerging research or statistics around the world. What you will get after this webinar are links to many different resources that you can find to really educate yourself on the different types of tips to improve your mental health, and also raising your awareness of the types of mental illnesses that exist. Lastly, and most importantly, and one that I'm also really relearning as well, is to choose our words wisely. When it comes to discussing mental health and mental illness, the words that we choose matter more than we think. The way that we talk about it can have a big impact on other people as well without even realizing it. And if we choose words that could be upsetting or perhaps create moments of exclusion or discomfort, it once again reinforces the stigma and stereotypes. So what are some words that we perhaps should reconsider and avoid saying, and what are some better alternatives we could use? So one of the best advice that we want to recommend to you is to avoid sharing or saying, for example, if you notice that mentally ill person or they suffer from a mental illness. What could be some of the potential explanations why we highly recommend not to avoid saying such terms? When we define and immediately put the mental illness that this individual has in front of them, we have to recognize that there are far more sides to them besides their mental illness. But if we put it forefront, we are actually making that person all about them living with a mental illness. And of course, when we say that an individual is suffering from a mental illness, it could once again get them to feel that this is a painful, challenging ordeal that they have to deal with. As we mentioned earlier, this might not be true because a person could be mentally diagnosed with a mental illness, but however, be mentally healthy. So what could you say in this instance? You could simply reframe and say, a person living with a mental illness, or I know an individual who has been diagnosed with a mental illness, or a person I know is living with a mental illness instead. So you're recognizing that the person comes first, and then part of their identity is that they are being diagnosed or living with a mental illness. Very simple switch in words, but means a great deal to that individual. Second advice and tip here. One of the words that I also catch myself saying is that if I observe an individual behaving who is super well organized or likes things super clean, I might say that person is so OCD, or I might even use these terms on myself as well. Or if we see an individual's mood is going, shifting in different patterns quite frequently, we might actually end up saying, oh, that person is being so bipolar this week, or why am I being so bipolar this week? This is where the stigma of talking about mental illness could perhaps be coming from, because what we are actually saying is that when we are using a mental illness, a diagnosed mental illness, to describe behavior, it could make it very difficult for someone to openly share that they might be dealing with either an obsessive compulsive disorder or might be bipolar as well. So this is where we have to highly recommend avoid using a mental illness to describe behavior that we notice, but instead say that person is highly organized and very meticulous, or I noticed a recent change in their mood this week. So we are just describing the behavior for what we see and not putting a label, particularly one that is of a diagnosable mental illness. And this, in a way, would really help the person feel much more included, and to make sure that these mental health and mental illnesses do not sound like indictments as well. And lastly, we move on to the interpersonal actions that we could practice. So with your raised awareness around mental health through the education and resources that are available, we also need to be equipped with a very safe and simple approach about how we can navigate mental health discussions. Mostly either if we are approaching somebody to check in on them, if we are noticing certain behaviors which may be worrying, or in a scenario that someone has chosen to come to you to discuss and share about their mental health. And we also firstly need to recognize that someone who comes to us has probably rethought this a lot, challenged themselves on the pros and cons, and had built up a lot of courage to talk to you about their struggles. So the best that we can do is make sure that we make the individual feel safe and feel heard. And a simple approach and a framework that's taught actually in mental health first aider training is one called the ALGE framework. I'll show you an example of how you can use this to navigate the conversation, and I will also show you a real life example of the words that you could use if ever you find yourself in this situation. The first part of the ALGE model is approach, where if you were observing an individual or an individual came to you, firstly, assess for risk, the crisis, or potential violent behavior that the person could be demonstrating. And of course, check and approach them to check with the person to just see how they're doing. But most importantly, as you approach them, get their permission as well, because it's on them of whether they feel comfortable to share this information with you. So the first step is approach, assess, and make sure that you have their permission for them to share openly and for you to be able to listen. Secondly, once you've got their permission and they're able to share openly with you, listen. Let the other person be heard without judgment and do not interrupt. At this point, paying attention to the verbal and non-verbal behaviors of the person and stepping out of your frame of reference to better empathize with the person. And as they share their experiences, after they've shared, give. Provide them the reassurance that their experience is valid and that you actually recognize that what they're going through is their experience and one that we should recognize or not deny, or to get them to feel that this is not normal. We would need to give the assurance. And once you've given the assurance, the last part of the ALGE framework is to encourage. Share supportive tips and provide options for them to seek out professional help if requested. The beauty of this ALGE model is not to help them to solve for, or not for them to be cured or to be immediately getting ways to overcome their struggles or their challenges. The goal of this model is to ensure that you are able to listen, provide support, and direct them to seek out the right professional support that they may need. So just to recap here, it's approach, listen, give, and encourage. Let's walk through a scenario of a conversation between two individuals of how we can apply this ALGE framework. So in this situation, if I notice that someone is experiencing low energy or at a low state of mental health, I would approach them and ask, I recognize that it has been a tough week for you or a tough period. I really just wanted to take the time to check in on how you are doing. Would you like to talk about it? And at this point, I'm opening up the dialogue. I'm listening to them and I'm getting their permission if they would like to talk about it. If they would say yes, I would listen. If they would say no, I could simply end off by saying, if you won't like to talk about it, it's completely okay. If you ever do, I'm around. So what I'm signaling is my allyship that I will be here when you need me to be here. So if they choose to want to discuss it openly, I'm going to listen. And as they share their experience and before they go into that, I'll let them know, take your time. There is no rush. I'm with you and I'm listening. And after they have shared, I'll paraphrase and just to make sure that I've confirmed what I've heard and just say, what I'm hearing is that over this tough period, you have experienced so-and-so symptoms or so-and-so behaviors or struggles that you've been having with your mental health, just to make sure that I've completely understood what they've said. And after I have that confirmed, I'm going to give them assurance. I'm going to say, thank you for sharing this with me. I know it might have been highly uncomfortable. And you know what? You are allowed to feel this way. Your feelings are absolutely valid. And at this point, I will give them an encouragement by simply asking, thank you for sharing with me. If you need any way of how can I be support of you, let me know without overstepping, because I want to be there for you, but I don't want to overstep your boundaries or giving you advice that you might not need. And I might also just ask them kindly, would you like me to share a list of options that are available that can help you navigate through this better with more professional help? So simply by using the ALGE framework, it gives you a set of tools and an approach and even some words that can really make sure the person feels heard, listened, and supported. And not to worry, you will get an access to this deck, giving you all the details that you can refer to after this workshop. So the top tips when you are in interpersonal conversations with someone about mental health, how can you best practice allyship? Let's walk through some top do's and don'ts. For do's, if someone does come up to you to openly share about their struggles, appreciate them for opening up. We recognize that it's very uncomfortable and very hard for someone to do so. And it took them so much courage for them to do that. Secondly, do not look into rushing the person to get them to share all the details. Follow the person's lead instead and let them lead in terms of what they feel comfortable to share with you. And lastly, we're not here to give them the solutions and not here to solve whatever challenges they might be struggling, because sometimes that might be out of our own individual capacity. We have to be instead the bridge to resources and to professional help if needed, if they have requested for it. What we don't recommend is to pressure anyone to discuss openly about their mental health. It might be very uncomfortable for them, or they might feel caught off guard. As we mentioned earlier, an individual action is firstly you opening up and hopefully creating an environment where people feel safe to talk about it. But we should not be in a position to pressure someone by asking them, tell me more about your mental health right now. Secondly, if someone does disclose to you, avoid making it a big deal, like either looking shocked or either in your body language when someone discloses this information. It's important that we normalize the conversation so that this no longer becomes a stigma. And lastly, what we are there for and practicing allyship is about the other person. It's not about us, right? We oftentimes like to make and share our own lived experiences as well. And I highly recommend to avoid doing so because it's not about us, it is about the other person. So these are some of the top tips of practicing interpersonal actions when we are looking into allyship for one another. So what I'm going to do now in this last section before I hand it off to Alonso is I'd like everyone to take the time as we reflected and shared with you the top tips around individual actions for allyship as well as interpersonal actions. I'm just going to launch another final Mentimeter to get you to share what is one action that you would like to consider to start practicing allyship to show up as a better mental health ally. So have the chance to reflect and I'll launch our final Menti. So type in the Mentimeter, one action that you would like to commit towards being a mental health ally. We've walked through individual allyship actions and interpersonal allyship actions. Let's hear from you, one action that you'd like to commit towards. Listen, consider. You like to check in and support. You want to demonstrate empathy? Great. You like to reassure, be more open. You like to make yourself available. Knowing where to get help, and that's definitely going to be very useful as Alonso will be able to walk you through some of the ways that you can navigate through the resources here. Thank you so much. These are very good actions to begin your journey to practice becoming a mental health ally. I'm with you on this. Give the time, reassure, be listening, be open. And yes, it starts from there. It just starts with one tiny action of re-evaluating ourselves in order to really support the people that would need us. And when we all start with just one tiny action, it creates ripples, it shifts the culture, and it creates inclusive, empowering, and safe spaces. So thank you so much for walking through this webinar with us, where we talked you through the state of mental health, the continuum, where you're at, and also some actions that we can do to make mental health a more open topic that we can discuss and check in with one another to be better and bring our full selves to work. And to wrap up this session, I'd like to hand it over to Alonso Ballon, who is currently leading up the Wellness ERG, to share with us some resources of how can we get started on this journey. Alonso, over to you.
Thank you very much, Edwin, for your great explanation about wellness, mental health, and mental illness. So we don't have much time, so I'm going to try to be quick for you. So we know that 2020 and 2021 have been really challenging for many of us. So where can we? So here in your screen, you will see different resources we can use. And the first one is the Rome Institute. So the Gender, Diversity and Inclusion function across the world. To external confidential counseling through an organization called the Rome Institute. The Rome Institute is a highly experienced organization used by several UN agencies for their counseling services. So sessions may take between 30 to 1 hour, and a staff member can have access of a total of Spanish, French, Italian, German, Dutch, and Arabic. No one, not your manager or your HR team, will ever know that you access the counseling. And it is for free. So to get a private, confidential appointment, you can write to the email you see in front of your screen, or just go to the webpage that you see to find more information about the Rome Institute. Likewise, if you have a medical insurance, this may include coverage for a psychological counseling. You can ask to your HR team or just go to the webpage of your insurance and try to find out if they have like an employee assistance program. If you have this opportunity, use it. And the last resource that we have is, of course, the HR team. So you can talk to your HR colleagues or manager if you feel confident enough and comfortable around them. If not, you can always talk to a member of your family, to your closer friends, or a member of your community. So it is important to talk openly about your emotions and to really answer to the question, how are you? Next, please, Evan. Okay, so if you feel or you are passionate about wellness and want to make a difference, please join us, okay? All what you need to do is to send me an email. You can send me an email in front of your screen. You write me an email, and we will love you to have you in our ERG. So we need more hands to implement activities related to wellness. So don't miss this opportunity. We need you, and we want to implement more activities in this year.
Thank you, Alonso, for sharing the resources. In summary, what we wanted to wrap up for today's workshop is that mental health is one that is still misunderstood and stigmatized in our workplaces. However, we can break this stigma by together, when we practice allyship, we can create more trusting, more psychologically safe and inclusive space for everybody to thrive in. So we hope you learned some key tips, got some access to resources, and also if you would like to make a difference, joining the Wellness ERG. Thank you so much. We've almost come to the end, and I'd like to hand it back to Helen, our GDI Senior Advisor.
Hi, thank you, Edwin. Just to say thank you to everyone for your participation. We really appreciate you spending the time with us. And just a few personal thank yous. First of all, to Alonso for leading the ERG and for putting this session together for everybody. And then to his support team, to Michelle, Fotsi and Victoria Pezzi, who have been in the background, sorting out the events, making it all happen. We really appreciate it. And a final thank you to Claudia for taking some time to open the session with us. Hope that you've enjoyed the session, and thanks again for joining us.